Thank you all for coming. This is a very exciting event and really exciting day for us. I'm Anthony Carpi. I'm Dean of Research at the college, and I want to welcome you all to John Jay, as well as send the regrets of her president, Carol Mason. Carol is a big proponent of the Data Collaborative for Justice and would have loved to have been here, but unfortunately had a long-standing commitment to the College Personnel Committee. This is a really exciting day for John Jay. Through the hard work of our former president and guest, Jeremy Travis, the Misdemeanor Justice Project was launched in 2013. The idea was to use data to address some of the inequities that existed in the criminal justice system. Under the successful leadership of Jeremy and Dr. Preeti Shah, MJP developed a unique model for studying lower-level offenses, such as misdemeanors. This model is grounded in three key principles. Collaboration. MJP works closely with government partners and decision makers to ensure that the data they produce are not only accurate, but also relevant to the public policy and agency operations. Transparency. The project focuses on producing reports that provide an unbiased view of lower-level enforcements. And neutrality. A core feature of the MJP model is to remain neutral on policy changes. The operation provides policymakers, researchers, and others with the necessary data to have an informed dialogue about issues related to community safety, justice, and fairness in the criminal justice system. And MJP has been incredibly successful in this mission. The project has produced multiple reports that provide a broad picture of lower-level enforcement in New York, including misdemeanor arrests, criminal summonses, and pedestrian stops. MJP has looked at these activities over a decade in order to understand how these actions have changed over time and how they've impacted communities in New York. This mission and the MJP model is really at the core of what John Jay strives to do as an institution, to inform and educate around issues of criminal, social, and all types of justice toward promoting informed decisions that help challenge current preconceptions and address inequities in these systems. Now, almost a half dozen years since the launch of the Misdemeanor Justice Project, we're here today to announce the launch of a much broader effort, the Data Collaborative for Justice. The Data Collaborative for Justice will continue the work of the Misdemeanor Justice Project, but more importantly, it will draw on the core principles of collaboration, transparency, and neutrality toward a much broader array of criminal justice issues. As you'll see today, we'll be hearing about their work on trends in marijuana enforcement. I'd like to take a moment to thank our esteemed speakers from the Governor's Office, the New York Police Department, and Arnold Ventures for joining us today. And now I'm truly delighted to introduce my colleague and friend and the director of the Data Collaborative for Justice, Dr. Preeti Shah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dean Carpi, and thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. It's so great to see so many familiar and friendly faces in the room who have supported us as the Misdemeanor Justice Project, and I hope will continue to support us under our new brand of the Data Collaborative for Justice. And colleagues in this room from state and local government, as well as nonprofit organizations and other institutions, have really been key collaborators for us in supporting our mission of ensuring that data and facts are at the core of criminal justice reform discussions. And I want to say a special thank you to First Deputy Commissioner Ben Tucker for being here this morning, and Alfonso David is actually on his way, Counsel to the Governor. I really cannot think of two more critical people to comment on the findings of our analysis on marijuana enforcement. I'm really appreciative of your time. And a special thank you to the entire MJP team. Some former members are here, and then some current members are here. So thank you, everyone. Carrie, Mayor, Olive, Cecilia, Quinn, Richie, Adam, Jayoke, Evan, and Irvin. So it's great to have everyone here. So as Dean Carpy mentioned, today's really a pivot point for us, and we're sort of subsuming MJP under this new brand of Data Collaborative for Justice. And we're really doing this for two main reasons. One is an expansion on our focus in terms of content, and the other is an expansion on our focus in terms of geography. So while we'll continue to focus on misdemeanor arrests going forward, because we really do think enforcement of lower level offenses is at the core of police community relationships, we'll also expand to other aspects of the criminal justice system, such as case processing and confinement in jails. And with this expanded focus, we want to dig deeper into the system and focus on additional data and research that is related, that has implications for community safety, health, well-being, as well as for the legitimacy of the criminal justice system as a whole. And second, as many of you may know, we're now working nationally and have expanded our work beyond New York State with the Research Network on Misdemeanor Justice. And we've exported this model that Anthony mentioned of collaboration, transparency, and neutrality to 7 other jurisdictions around the country who will continue our work or their work in their areas. All of this to meet our new vision, which is for every community in the nation to use data and research as a basis for a shared vision for how to achieve public safety in a manner that is just, equitable, and increases trust and confidence in the criminal justice system. So you have this little document on your chairs, which actually shares our story, our approach, our mission, and our impact. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge that our new vision as well as messaging strategy would not have been possible without one of my colleagues who couldn't be here today, Erica Bond. Erica joined us a few months ago as the Chief Policy Strategist, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have her on board, and she's been really critical to this new pivot. And with that, I want to introduce the founder of the Misdemeanor Justice Project, my longtime mentor, colleague and friend, Jeremy Travis, to discuss our future endeavors a bit more. Most people in this room know Jeremy, but for those of you who don't, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about him. Jeremy has a long career in criminal justice. He's currently the Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice for Arnold Ventures. He was the president of John Jay College for 13 years and led the transformation of the college into a senior liberal arts college. And prior to his time at John Jay, he was a senior fellow with the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute, director of the National Institute for Justice, as well as the Deputy Commissioner for Legal Matters for the New York City Police Department. So with that, Jeremy, would you like to come up and say a few words?
Thank you, Preeti, and good morning to everyone. I also feel like I'm here among friends. It's nice to be back home at John Jay, the college I love. But more importantly, it's great to be here to celebrate the launch of the Data Collaborative for Justice and to support this new research center, newly named research center at John Jay, as it releases this very timely report on enforcement of marijuana laws across New York State. So I share the hope that the authors have, which is that this report will inform policy discussions now underway in our state. Policy discussions that have been promoted by Governor Cuomo, other political leaders and activists about the future of marijuana legalization and enforcement in our state, and in particular ways to reduce racial disparities such as those documented in this report. So a very well-timed release of a great report by the MJP team. I must add that it also gives me special pleasure on behalf of my colleagues at Arnold Ventures, formerly known as the Lauren John Arnold Foundation, to make a formal announcement this morning of a $1.7 million 3-year grant to support the continued work of the Misdemeanor Justice Project under the new umbrella of the Data Collaborative for Justice. So it's nice to come and bring that news as well. Approximately 6 years ago, when I was president of John Jay, I first broached the idea of conducting research on trends in misdemeanor arrests with Dr. Preeti Chauhan. 6 years ago, when we started this work, just to put it in context, this was before the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner at the hands of police officers. It was before the Department of Justice Ferguson report that laid bare the systemic uses of the justice system to raise money and to promote and perpetuate racial oppression. We here in New York were at that time in the midst of what we now look back on and call the stop and frisk era, when there was a sharp rise in that type of enforcement activity in our city, documented by some colleagues here at John Jay and others. Preeti and I looked at that trend and thought that that issue might be resolved either by the courts or by a political process of new leadership in the city or new leadership in the police department, and that turned out to be right in hindsight. But we became fascinated with another trend in New York. There was less on the public mind, less in discussion in terms of the research community, and less aware in the views of those who were charged with enforcing the law and prosecuting criminal offenses. And that was the increase, sharp increase over 20 years or so in misdemeanor arrests. That fascination is the launch of the Misdemeanor Justice Project. So I broached the idea of conducting research on this topic with Preeti, and I'm just glad she said yes. So look around at what has happened in the 6 years since then. There's been a steady stream of groundbreaking reports, many of which have been presented in this room or with the help of the Citizens Crime Commission, for which we will always be grateful. There's been a remarkable burst of scholarship documented in the two-page handout that you just received that Preeti has led through her Research Advisory Committee. There's been newspaper stories in virtually every major national and New York publication, prompted by the work of the Misdemeanor Justice Project. There have been symposia hosted here at John Jay with scholars and experts and activists on the issue of misdemeanor justice. This work has been presented at national conferences. And what is particularly noteworthy, of course, is that the reforms that have flowed from this work here in New York have been stunning. And I don't think Preeti and I certainly wouldn't want to claim credit at all for those reforms because they're a result of a political consensus that, particularly on summonses, misdemeanors, and certainly stop and frisk, that we need to do something differently, and we need to draw back the reach of the law enforcement and criminal justice systems. But there's no doubt in my mind, although I'm not objective on this, that the work of MJP informed those policy discussions and prompted those reforms. So it's deeply gratifying to look back on that 6-year history. So Preeti, it's wonderful on a personal level and a professional level to stand with you today at this moment of inflection as we celebrate the pioneering work that you and this remarkable team have conducted here and increasingly around the country. You have shed light in a very dark corner of the criminal justice system, which is the enforcement of low-level crimes. You've inspired others to take on this cause. There are now at least 2 major books that we're in touch with, one by Isa Kola-Hausman and another by Alexandra Natapov on misdemeanor enforcement. The Public Policy Institute of California, inspired by MJP, has recently released, and I'm proud to say that we funded that at Arnold, a statewide analysis of similar trends. Our hope is, as Preeti indicated, that this will become something that every state does, every jurisdiction does, hold up a mirror to its own practices to ask why we do things the way we do and what's the impact of those practices. So because of your research, our city has realized that some of the practices that you documented do not conform with our sense of justice, and you have provoked the policy discussions that led to profound changes. So let me add a word of thanks to Dean Karpy for your unwavering support of MJP, and now the transition to the Data Collaborative for Justice. When he gets here, I'll thank Alfonso David for being in our state. If you don't know Alfonso, you're in for a treat, because this man is a real steady advocate for justice in the halls of highest levels of government in our state on behalf of human rights and particularly now criminal justice reform. Watch what's about to happen in this session. It's going to be pretty profound. And of course, I want to give a special thanks to First Deputy Commissioner Ben Tucker, a friend of longstanding and John Jay alum, just want to have to put that in here. Ben, you have recognized I've seen it in the interior discussions within the police department. You've been a voice for research, but in specific importance to this group, a supporter and a fan of the Misdemeanor Justice Project and the work that Preeti and her team have done. So it's great to be with you today, and I look forward to the presentation. Thanks.
So now to the data. Thank you, Jeremy. So now we're going to focus on the report. And, excuse me. And the report that you have in front of you examines trends in the enforcement of marijuana arrests in New York State for nearly 3 decades. And I just want to say a special thank you to the Division of Criminal Justice Services for providing us the data because this work wouldn't have been possible without that. So a special thank you to Executive Deputy Commissioner Michael Green, Deputy Commissioner Terry Salo, and Director of Research Leslie Kellum, who's here in the audience and came down from Albany. Thank you, Leslie. In a few minutes, my colleague Meredith Patton, who's the director of the Research Network on Misdemeanor Justice, will present key findings to you from our report. The full report, which you have in front of you, is 135 pages and covers misdemeanor arrests in New York, covers marijuana enforcement in New York City, upstate cities, which are Albany, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and Yonkers, and then the rest of the state from 1990 to 2017. And then we focus in on marijuana possession, excluding sale enforcement by demographics, sex, age, and race and ethnicity for each geographic area, as well as cover outcomes of dispositions and sentences. So, and then our appendices actually have some county-level analyses as well. So we obviously can't go into all the details of the full report, so Meredith's presentation will really focus on 3 sort of policy-relevant highlights. So I want to take a few minutes to focus on the findings that we think are essential and why we think those are essential. And we think this is important given that the state seems poised to make significant legislative change to the law on marijuana enforcement, and many local enforcement agencies, including the NYPDs and the DAs, have already started to modify their policies and practices. So our data raised some questions about 3 areas for the public and for policymakers in the era of changing marijuana policy. So the first is whether and how reforms should address individuals found burning or consuming marijuana in public. In states where marijuana possession has been legalized, it still remains unlawful to publicly burn or consume. And public burn actually constitutes the overwhelming majority of marijuana enforcement in New York State. So the question is, how do we handle this issue as a state or locally, and should this continue to be criminalized or should it be dealt with in a different capacity? The second area is how do we respond to young people found in possession of marijuana? So states where marijuana has been legalized, possession for individuals under 21 remains unlawful. And our data shows that individuals under 21 consistently had the highest rates of arrest statewide over the period of decades. And the third area is the extent to which legal and policy changes are able to address racial differences in arrest rates for marijuana possession. So we highlight this because a significant impetus for reform has been concerns regarding racial differences in arrests for Blacks and Hispanics relative to whites. And there's some evidence that reduced enforcement may not necessarily reduce racial differences in enforcement. And in states that have legalized marijuana possession, there's actually evidence that racial differences have widened over time rather than narrowed, even though absolute enforcement has gone down. And what you'll see in our data is that across all 3 geographic areas, so New York City, upstate cities, and the rest of the state, Black and Hispanics had consistently higher rates of arrests for marijuana possession compared to whites. And even with declines in recent years, these racial differences have widened in our jurisdictions as well. But notably in 2017, the racial differences in arrest rates for marijuana possession were wider in upstate cities and the rest of the state compared to New York City. So as mentioned earlier, the Data Collaborative for Justice seeks to provide the public, policymakers, and others with objective sources of data and research on really important criminal justice topics. But we do not take a position on where law and policy should come out on these questions. We just raise them. But we do see it as our responsibility to ensure that the extensive amount of data that we provide is provided in a way that enables non-researchers to use it to inform policy and decision-making. So going forward, we're redoubling our efforts to make our work a little bit more accessible than a 135-page report with figure after figure. So in conjunction to the traditional report, we've also released a 10-page research brief. This summarizes key findings, provides context for the data in the report, an overview of some recent policy changes by police departments and district attorneys around the state. We've also published a timeline on our website, which Quinn's going to bring up in just a minute, which looks at marijuana policies in the United States since the early 1990s and really focuses on federal policy and then state-level policy from 1914 all the way to present day, and we'll continue to update that timeline as new reforms are being passed. So we really hope people use that as a resource. So it's our hope that these shorter, more dynamic resources will allow even more people to access our work and understand the implications of our work, and also to provide historical context for the data we present so people have some sense of what may be driving these trends, and ensure that people know what aspects of our reports may be most relevant for policy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meredith.
Thank you, Preeti. Okay. So before we get into the data for marijuana possession, I want to give you a broad overview of the trends in all misdemeanor arrests for marijuana in New York City, upstate cities, and the rest of the state from 1990 to 2017. So we see the blue line here is New York City, the green line is upstate cities, and the red line is the rest of the state. On the left, we have the number, and we see these dramatic fluctuations in New York City, the blue line. On the right, we take the population base into account, so this is the rate. We see those fluctuations again for New York City, not as dramatic, but some nonetheless in upstate cities, and a rather steady increase in rest of the state, the red line. So now we want to highlight the increases and the changes over these geographies. So the other thing I want to mention is that we see this increase over time in all three geographic areas from 1990 to 2017 in the rate of arrests for overall marijuana. And so I'm going to show you some numbers from 2010 to 2017. And I just want to say we're using 2010 as a benchmark because that is the most recent peak rate for marijuana arrests in New York City. So we see in New York City there was a 62% decrease in the number of misdemeanor marijuana arrests. So that's from 57,000 down to 21,000 in 2017. Similarly, we see an almost 50% decrease in upstate cities, and that's 1,600 down to over 800 in 2017. And in contrast, in the rest of the state, we see a 33% increase. Now, as Preeti had mentioned, for most of the study period, marijuana enforcement was related to marijuana possession rather than sale in all three geographic areas. So we see that throughout the state, 85 to 96% of these arrests are for possession and not for the sale penal law codes. In New York City, that's 85% are for arrests for possession, and in the rest of the state, upwards of 96% are for possession rather than sale. But we also see some geographic variation in the enforcement of these specific penal law codes. In New York City and the rest of the state, we see that it's predominantly public view and public burn, where we'll see a more even distribution in upstate cities. So here, this is highlighting New York City and the rest of the state. For public view, public burn, over 90% are for that penal law code for misdemeanor marijuana possession arrests, and upwards of 70% in the rest of the state. And here we see this even distribution across the three possession penal law codes for marijuana arrests in upstate cities. So now what I'm going to do is disaggregate this data by age. And again, we're still focusing specifically on marijuana possession. So in 2017, 18 to 20-year-olds had the highest marijuana possession arrest rate in both New York City and the rest of the state. And this is relative to our other age groups, which include the youngest age group for us, which is 16 to 17-year-olds. So here, there's a lot of lines here, so I'll just go through what the colors are. The red line is 16 to 17-year-olds. The blue line is 18 to 20-year-olds. The green line is 21 to 24-year-olds. The purple line is 25 to 34-year-olds. And the orange line, which is consistently our bottom line, is 35 to 65-year-olds. So again, we see these dramatic fluctuations in all of the age groups in New York City over time, but we do see the blue line, the 18 to 20-year-olds, the magnitude of their arrest rates for possession of marijuana arrests are significantly higher. Now, in upstate cities, we don't see as clear of a pattern. But we do see in 2017, the green line, which is our 21 to 24-year-old age category, has the highest rate of misdemeanor marijuana possession arrests in upstate cities. And then in the rest of the state, we see a more steady increase for all of our age groups over the time period. So again, just putting some numbers to this, using that 2010 date as our benchmark. From 2010 to 2017, 16 to 17-year-olds had the largest declines, proportional declines in marijuana possession arrests across all three geographic areas. So in New York City, that was a 76% decline, and that translates to over 3,000 fewer arrests for 16 to 17-year-olds. And in upstate cities, 77% decline, and that's 106 fewer arrests. And in the rest of the state, there was also a decline, not as significant, but a decline nonetheless. And of course, the volume is lower than what we see in New York City. Now, our 18 to 20-year-old age group, which we spoke about earlier, also had declines in these arrest rates for New York City and upstate cities, but not the rest of the state. So we see a 67% decline in New York City, and again, this is translating into almost 7,000 fewer arrests for 18 to 20-year-olds in New York City from 2010 to 2017. Upstate cities, almost 70% proportional decline, which is 263 fewer arrests, and in the rest of the state, we see a 26% increase over time, which is reflected in those figures that we showed. So now we're going to disaggregate by race and ethnicity. I will say we do not have reliable race and ethnicity data for upstate cities and the rest of the state prior to 2002, so our data for those geographic areas starts at that point in time. But across the study, we see that blacks had consistently higher rates of arrests relative to Hispanics and then whites. So in New York City here, the blue line is non-Hispanic blacks, the green line is Hispanics, the red line is non-Hispanic whites. Again, seeing the dramatic fluctuations, the increases followed by more recent decreases, but recognizing the magnitude of the difference in the rates of arrest between blacks and Hispanics, and then followed by whites. Similarly, we see a pattern like that in upstate cities as well. Again, the data is starting from 2002. And the rest of the state. So we're seeing that blue line, there's that significant, there's higher rates of arrest for non-Hispanic blacks followed by Hispanics across all three geographic areas. So again, giving you some information about these proportional declines or increases and accompanied them with absolute numbers. From 2010 to 2017, whites had, even though, with the volume going down, whites had the largest declines in marijuana possession arrest rates in New York City and upstate cities. So what does this mean? In New York City, with the 72% proportional decline, that's 4,000 fewer arrests from 2010 to 2017 for whites in New York City. We also saw this decline in upstate cities, almost 60% decline, which is almost 100 fewer arrests for whites. And we see in the rest of the state, because there was a decline in population, the proportional rate actually increased by 1%, but that translates into 33 fewer arrests. I know that's not an error, it just looks a little wonky. And then we see for blacks, we also saw significant declines in New York City and upstate cities. So in New York City, there was a 70% proportional decline for blacks from 2010 to 2017. But if we look at the absolute numbers, that's 19,000, over 19,000 fewer arrests for blacks in New York City. And in upstate cities, we're seeing a 50% decline, over 5,000 fewer arrests. In the rest of the state, an increase with over 500 additional arrests from 2010 to 2017. So I think when we look at these proportional declines and the absolute numbers, we can see, it's pretty powerful in terms of what's happening here from 2010 to 2017. Okay. And Preeti had mentioned about the racial differences that we examined as well, and we found that in New York City and upstate cities, racial differences in arrest rates had increased. So what this means in New York City in 1990, blacks were 5.1 times more likely to be arrested for a misdemeanor marijuana possession charge compared to whites, and that increased in 2017 to over 8 times more likely. We see a similar pattern with the increase in upstate cities, where in 2002, blacks were almost 10 times more likely to be arrested for a marijuana possession charge. And now in 2017, our data shows over 12 times more likely. And we see in the rest of the state, while from 2002 to 2010, there was a slight decrease in these differences between blacks and whites, nonetheless, there was an increase to blacks being over 11 times more likely to be arrested compared to their white counterparts in 2017. But with this, what we do see across the study period, that in New York City, these racial differences are narrower relative to upstate cities and the rest of the state. So where in 2017, blacks were 8.1 times more likely to be arrested compared to whites, they're 12 times and 11 times more likely to be arrested in upstate cities and the rest of the state, respectively. So that was sort of a snapshot of some high-level findings, and we wanted to streamline it for you. As Preeti mentioned and showed you, we have a lot of materials for you today. We have our report that's over 100 pages. It also provides, in the appendices, all of the data and figures across the years. We have our brief, which gives a lot of our key findings as well as some policy context, and it's a really easily digestible piece of material that we're proud of in this pivot to being the data collaborative for justice, and then our dynamic timeline, which she demonstrates, which you can find on our newly launched website. So we hope that you'll be able to use all of these as a resource as you're examining this issue and thinking about things in terms of legislative reform in New York State. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So with that, I would like to invite Alfonso David, Counsel to the Governor, to come up and speak. So a little bit of background on Mr. David. Since his 2015 appointment by Governor Andrew Cuomo, Mr. David has served as the Governor's Chief Counsel and Principal Legal Advisor. In his role, he oversees all significant legal and policy deliberations affecting the state. And he's played a significant role in crafting and shaping criminal justice and social justice reform, including the Governor's Reentry Council, drafted the executive order for the special prosecutor in matters related to the deaths of unarmed civilians caused by law enforcement, eased barriers for New Yorkers with criminal convictions, worked on raise the age legislation, and LGBTQI rights. Prior to his appointment, Mr. David has worked as an attorney, law professor, and policy advisor with significant litigation and management experience in public, private, and non-for-profit sectors. And particularly relevant for today, Mr. David led the governor's work group which drafted legislation for a regulated adult-use marijuana program that is being considered in the current session. Mr. David, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning. First, I did not appreciate that you had a very robust security system here in John Jay College. To get in was quite an ordeal. Welcome. Thank you. First, I would like to, of course, acknowledge John Jay College for hosting this event. the Misdemeanor Justice Project for doing such fantastic work on the report, the John Arnold Foundation for supporting this and so many other criminal justice work, Benjamin Tucker, of course, the first Deputy Commissioner at the NYPD, and Jeremy Travis, Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Foundation or Ventures. And then there are two people in the audience that I need to recognize. The first is Axel Burnaby, who's an assistant counsel. He works in my office, has been spending an extraordinary amount of time working on this issue. And the second person is Jason Starr, who's an assistant counsel in my office as well. And he has been working on these issues day in and day out, making sure that we have the most informed, comprehensive policy to advance. As you heard a few minutes ago, despite a dramatic decline in the rate of marijuana misdemeanor arrests over the past decade, unfortunately, there remain significant racial disparities in the rates of arrest. So in short, we may be arresting and charging less people with marijuana misdemeanor possession, but we are increasingly and disproportionately arresting and charging more minorities. Politically, there is some consensus that our public policy on public safety should focus more on offenses that directly affect people, particularly violent crime. This consensus has driven significant reforms in law and in policy at both the state and the federal levels. Marijuana decriminalization, the Rockefeller drug law reforms, the closure of many prisons here in New York State, the federal sentencing reform, and the list goes on and on. However, this shift in public attitudes and policies highlights some of the greatest areas of concern with regard to system inequities, and the data in this report illuminates one of those major concerns, areas of concerns, marijuana enforcement. Marijuana was decriminalized in New York State in 1977, when offenses related to marijuana was removed from the controlled substances provisions of the penal law, and it was placed in a different statutory scheme with what was intended to be less serious penalties. However, as this report unfortunately shows, in the period over the last 20 years, there has been significant inconsistency in enforcement among New York City, upstate cities, and the rest of the state, and significant disparities in enforcement by age, by race, and by ethnicity. A few of the key findings of the report with some historical backdrop provide some context and again highlights why it's so important that our public policy be driven by data. Since 1990, marijuana arrest rates have increased significantly across the state, as you heard. New York City has had the highest misdemeanor marijuana arrest rates for the majority of the time period compared to upstate cities and the rest of the state. And you could conclude, well, that makes sense because the majority of people live in New York City. But the majority of the misdemeanor marijuana enforcement is related to marijuana possession, not to marijuana sale. There is some geographic variation in enforcement. In New York City, predominantly public view or public harm. In upstate cities is more evenly distributed across the 3 possession penal codes. And then the rest of the state is predominantly public view or public harm. But across all of the geographic areas, Black men and women and Hispanic men and women are unfortunately being faced with higher rates of arrest for misdemeanor marijuana possession compared to their white counterparts. A difference in arrest rates for blacks relative to whites was higher in upstate cities than the rest of the state. In New York City, Black men and women were arrested for marijuana possession at a rate 8 times that of white men and women, and in upstate cities at a rate of 12 times that of white men and women. But even more significantly, Black men between ages 21 and 24 are arrested at a rate of more than 20 times that of white counterparts in upstate cities. These are the young people that we need to protect and are in most need of direction and support. These rates of arrests have been consistently increasing over the period of the study, despite an overall ultimate decline in the rate of misdemeanor arrests and a dramatic shift in cultural attitudes regarding marijuana. What did this tell us? What does all of this information tell us, and how should we use it in developing, evaluating, and potentially advancing public policy? Regardless of which side of the aisle you're sitting on, we should all be able to agree on one fundamental principle. Marijuana arrests and convictions have a significant direct and collateral impact on the lives of people that are affected. We should all be able to agree on that. Further, low-level marijuana enforcement places significant strain on the criminal justice system with very little impact on public safety. There are also other public policy costs, including significant impact on immigrant New Yorkers, our labor market, as well as public health. These realities, and the reality that an increasing number of neighboring jurisdictions have legalized or are considering legislative proposals to legalize marijuana, the possession and or the sale, led the governor to advance a proposal a few months ago. It seems like a few months ago, but actually it was a few weeks ago. It gives you a little insight into my brain. It was only a few weeks ago, but it feels like months and months ago because we've been working on this for so long. But those realities actually led the governor to advance a proposal to comprehensively regulate cannabis, including the establishment of a regulated commercial market that permits the sale and the possession of cannabis for recreational and therapeutic use by adults. In New York State, we previously legalized the use of medicinal cannabis through legislation that's called the Compassionate Care Act. This year, our proposal, which is referred to as the Cannabis Regulation and Taxation Act, it sets up the first in the nation integrated regulatory approach to cannabis in 3 applications. 1, medicinal, 2, adult use, and 3, industrial wellness. It brings together existing law and policy governing medical cannabis and industrial hemp, which is existing law in New York, and then it sets forth an innovative model for developing and regulating the commercial market for adult use recreational cannabis. The legislation also creates the Office of Cannabis Management to oversee the application and the development of this new integrated regulatory framework. Most significantly, our proposal attempts to address some of the disparate consequences demonstrated in the data in this report. In addition to reclassifying cannabis offenses in the penal law to permit possession for personal use, it automatically seals prior marijuana offenses. It provides for resentencing for felony and misdemeanor possession and sale to align with these new classifications. And it creates robust opportunities for participating in the new market for members of communities who have been disproportionately harmed by the enforcement of marijuana prohibition. I'm speaking specifically about Black and Latino communities. We are at yet another interesting crossroad as we further modify and reform our criminal justice laws and regulations. And the lives of real people are affected. And that's what I want us to think about as we talk about these issues. There are real men and women that are affected, upstate, downstate, in every part of this state, and in fact, every part of this country. I remember discussions when we embarked on the Rockefeller drug reforms. There were a lot of fear and anxiety to match the robust advocacy for change. And that discussion advanced, I would submit, primarily because of the data. People had to look at the facts. This is no different. As existing policies, opinions, methodologies, approaches are being challenged, we must first be sensitive to the concerns that are being raised in our communities, but we must be driven by the data. Good public policy must be informed by good data. And today's report confirms our approach regarding the regulation of cannabis. We believe that our integrated, fully regulated, culturally informed model is a strong path forward. and a model for addressing what continues to be a key driver of disparity in our criminal justice system. The lives of real people are at risk, and we have to pay attention, and we have to be driven by the data. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to invite Ben Tucker, the first Deputy Commissioner of the NYPD, to join us on stage. Commissioner Tucker, thank you so much for being here today and for being so supportive of our work for the past 6 years. It has really been really wonderful to have you in our corner. A little bit of background on the first Deputy Commissioner. Ben Tucker started his career at the NYPD in 1969 and has since worked in the public sector at both the city and federal level. For the city, he worked with both Mayor Koch and Mayor Bloomberg's administrations in multiple roles, including the Mayor's Office of Operations and Commission of Human Rights. At the federal level, he was appointed to the Department of Justice in 1995 by President Bill Clinton and the U.S. Office of National Drug Policy in 2009 by President Barack Obama. He returned to the NYPD in 2014, around when this project got started as Deputy Commissioner of Training and was subsequently promoted to his current role as First Deputy Commissioner. Relevant to today's conversation, as a part of the NYPD executive team, the first Deputy Commissioner Tucker worked very closely with Police Commissioner Jimmy O'Neill in developing NYPD's revised marijuana enforcement policy, which went into effect this past September. And I should note that our data end in 2017, and they don't take into account these dramatic declines that have occurred in arrests as a result of this new policy. So this new policy essentially said that the majority of lower level marijuana enforcement will be issued a summons, a criminal summons, rather than an arrest. First Deputy Commissioner received his JD from Fordham University, is a tenured professor at Pace University, but most importantly, he's a John Jay alum. So welcome back home.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Preeti, and thank you and your team for all of your work, Meredith, and all of the alums who are here who worked on the Misdemeanor Justice Project, and certainly my friend Jeremy Travis. Thank you. Jeremy and I go back in our careers, professional careers, and we have overlapped on a number of places here in New York at NYPD, and then later on in Washington, D.C. During the 90s on the cops and looking at how we were moving the agenda for policing in this country, as well as increasing the amount of research, I think, significantly around issues like enforcement and other issues that are impacted by our police. So I look forward to continuing the collaboration with the new entity, Data Collaborative for Justice, for sure. But looking back on 2014, when we first became partners, over this past 5 years, the NYPD, as you say, consistent with just coincidentally, I think, the most comprehensive review. We've been engaged in the most comprehensive reform effort in the history of the police department. And I want to talk a little bit about that because there's a trigger for it. But and so in the department's effort since 2014 to increase transparency, certainly, and also to share more data and information with the public for the express purpose of improving public safety generally, but also, and I think specifically, building trust with communities, and particular communities of color. So on that note, let me just, for context, because I think it's important, and some people may remember, some of you may not, but 2014 is a sea change moment in the history of the police department, and most people don't see it that way. I think, including some people still inside the police department, perhaps don't see it that way. But it in fact is and was one of those moments. So we had sometimes the stars aligned in a way that bring about tiny miracles. This was a huge miracle, I think, for the NYPD and certainly for the city of New York. And but how we got there is really related to the data and very much, I think, a catalyst for how we became so interested in the MJP because we had a new administration come in. So a new mayor and a new police commissioner in Bill Bratton, but a whole host of other people that I knew, colleagues and friends, returned to city government, and many of whom also returned to the NYPD. It's also the year that I came back in 2014. I was down at the White House Drug Policy Office thinking a lot about issues such as marijuana and certainly opioid addiction as well. So these issues are near and dear to my heart, and from a policy perspective, certainly the things that I care a lot about. But at the same time, while I was in Washington, I was looking and listening to what was happening here in New York. And one of the things that piece of statistics that I'll share with you, one statistic I'll share with you comes from 2011, where we reached 694,000 documented stops in this city. And 694,000 stops in 1 year in this city. About 80% of those stops were of young men of color, and less than 2% of those stops resulted in any kind of prosecution whatsoever. Many of those were DP'd by our 5 district attorneys. And so that's one of the catalysts for me for coming back to the department was just that data. I was asked by Commissioner Bratton, got a call, asked if I had an interest in returning, and I thought this was an opportunity to come back because he was back. It appeared we had a mayor who had just settled the 3 lawsuits that grew out of the stop and frisk debacle, and a whole host of other people whose names I recognize came back to city government as well. And so I thought maybe this is an opportunity to come back and maybe contribute. Came back as the Deputy Commissioner for Training. Bill Bratton asked me to really think about how we could shift the paradigm, particularly as it related to training new officers in the department. Prior to that, one of the challenges that gave rise to, one of the issues that gave rise to the 694,000 stops, principally was the fact that a lot of new officers, whoever was graduating from the police academy, were being assigned to one of the 12 impact zones, which were the most violent neighborhoods in the city at the time. And that was a real problem. So that's the context in which we embrace the work and being able to take advantage of the various studies that have taken place. As Alfonso mentioned, the data matters a lot, and it's given us the opportunity to really understand what we needed to do going forward, and we continue to use that data in that way. And so the idea of the present and the long-term trends accessible in accessible ways has been particularly helpful to the department in helping us assess enforcement in the context of crime trends and police policy changes and other changes occurring in the city. And so the data that was presented here validates our belief that we can bring crime down and reduce marijuana enforcement in particular, while also keeping the city safe. So 694,000 in 2011, just under 11,000 stops in 2018. It is, our crime rates are at their lowest ever. Homicides in 1990, which is the year, the low end of this particular study, were 2,245 people were murdered in this city. Last year, we ended with 292. So you get a sense of we've made some incredible progress. Crime is at its lowest ever in many instances since 1950, and in some cases in more than 60 years as well. So for me, this is, the changes that have occurred in the NYPD during this period, using some of this data or having this data validate some of the policy changes that we've made is extraordinarily significant and really make a huge difference in the way in which we do business and continue to do that as well. We are, for the last 5 years, been focused on not only how we can prove that we can continue to make the city safer at the same time as we reduce a number of our arrests by thousands. Certainly in the area of marijuana enforcement, we've, as a result of some of the data, we've made policy changes in a couple of instances in the last 2.5 or 3 years. First was to look at possession and begin to issue summonses in lieu of arrest. That was very significant, primarily because if you look at those 694,000 arrests and the 80% of those folks who were stopped, and you look at the circumstances around those arrests, it's pretty clear that many of those were for possession. Of course, the federal district judge who we now are working with and who has appointed the federal monitor, Peter Zimroth, with whom we continue to work to implement the remedial measures that the court has ordered, it really made it pretty clear that we had to focus very much on how we address our arrests in those cases. But lots of those unconstitutional arrests that took place were as a result of people emptying their pockets, or that's why we end up with possession as opposed to sales, because most of them occurred that way. So we've gotten, I think, much more focused. Retraining has helped tremendously. We train officers more now than we have in the history of this agency. I think, the more we train our officers, the better we train them, and the more we give them confidence in understanding what the law requires. I think it makes them better at what they do, gives them more confidence to feel like they do know what they're doing. And it's not just the officers on patrol, but it's the supervisors in particular as well. So as we stand here thinking about marijuana legalization, I'd be lying if I said I didn't have some trepidation about just the implications for what legalization might look like. As we've looked at other states, we've looked at Colorado, looked at Washington, those states who are sort of the first to legalize. And so we worry about, from a police perspective in particular, some of the challenges that represents. Even as we structure, the proposed structure calls for, age limits and so forth. But the concerns you raised in that regard, I think, are very real about how we deal with young people, how we deal with the folks who violate the public use provisions, all still have implications for NYPD and our officers in terms of what we do and how we do it. So we continue to sort of, I think, we'll pay attention to the data. We will continue to do our due diligence in sort of learning as much as we can about what's happening and where and how we might deal with that. Our response, and based on where we know the governor's office and where the state is going, as well as the report coming out of the mayor's office of criminal justice, raised some concerns as well. We've added our voice to that as a practical matter based on our conversations with our colleagues in other jurisdictions, and also what we know and what we are concerned about here in New York. So in any case, I can't thank you all enough for the work that you've done. And it's, I've always, as Jeremy mentioned, he and I both have always been very much interested in how data helps us do what we do and make really decent policy, great policy. And I brought that with me back to NYPD, and I continue to foster that approach, because I think that's what's going to make the difference. It has made a difference already. And I think we are, in terms of public safety in this city, in a place where we haven't been almost ever before. And the crime numbers continue to go down. These other issues are really complex. We will continue to look at the data, continue to sort of ponder and think about what we do and how we do it, particularly as it relates to public burn and young people in possession, and certainly the racial disparities are something that are central to us and always on our radar. It is a huge challenge to sort of think about the impact and figure out how we enforce the law, and when those numbers continue to suggest, even though they're lower than they have been, that we are still disproportionately policing communities of color at a higher rate, still is a very, very much a concern. And I'm not sure, frankly, what that number would have to be in order to have a sense of and understanding what the reasons for that. Always, though, trying to make sure that whatever the reasons, that they don't include unconstitutional policing. So those are the things I think about in my role every day, and I encourage, I nudge many others in the department to think about it that way as well, and particularly our senior executive staff, because they need to understand it. I think we all ought to be on the same page, but it is, if we can solve those, answer those questions, I think we'll be in a much better place as we go forward. So thank you for the opportunity to come and celebrate the work that you've done in the past, and to really congratulate you on the Data Collaborative for Justice going forward. I hope you will continue to keep us in the mix, and hopefully we can become a part of that initiative as well, since I think we still have a fair amount of work to do. So thanks very much.
I want to thank Jeremy, First Deputy Commissioner Tucker, and Counsel to the Governor, Alfonso David, for being here. We really appreciate your time, and I think we've started off on a strong launch with the focus on data and that being at the center of criminal justice policy reform. So thank you, everyone, for attending.